Excited for this week. I know it sounds really nerdy, right? I'm really excited about this material, but I really am, because this is the kind of work that I do. So I'm an international relations theorist. I am a critical security studies scholar. I am really interested in this question about how does a society, how does a group of people, how does a government, how does policy come to think about our world in terms of threat and not in terms of threat, and how we sort of produce these meaningful patterns of behavior that create what are called security politics. And I wanted to take just a minute to sort of revisit that, right? Just to put fine a point on here before we get into a discussion of the material for this week. By security politics, we really mean the basic sort of idea of who, what, where, when, and how, the who, what, where, when, and how questions about what becomes a security threat to a world and to a society and what doesn't. And then also to really point out that the what is there and the how there are these deeply sort of constructed ideas, right? That the nature of the things that we see that are threatening, and that the ways in which we think about responding to them are not just the manifestation of reflexive action. They're not just common sense, but instead they're sort of created over time through the process of securitization or through the play of discourse. They have a history, they emerge, right? And we know this because actually different societies will think about the same problem in different kinds of ways, right? So this is a really interesting problem. What I really wanted to also hone in on here is the idea that adopting this perspective doesn't mean we have to just argue, well, actually the world is really just a great place, and everything is fine, and actually everything is the manifestation of these symbols. That's also not true, right? So something like a terrorist group, and we hinted on this a little bit in the discussion forums for last week, they exist. They seek to do harm to people. They seek to use forms of political violence that are heinous, that are unacceptable, in order to pursue a political goal, right? What we can actually argue is that there may be a broader, wider, different set of tools we can use for addressing that in our global society that aren't necessarily fully brought out by simply calling their actions evil or simply referring it to military intervention, right? And that's really going to be the point that Kaldor tries to tease out when you get to that point in her argument in the book about the global war on terror as a security culture. The idea here is that means a very specific way of looking at these groups. It means a very specific way of understanding what motivates them and how they recruit and fundraise. It infers a very specific way of dealing with them, targeted assassination, special forces raids, so on and so forth, which may not simply be very well suited to dealing with the problem, okay? And if you get nothing out of this course, and I will reiterate, just because I'm a critical security studies person, just because I study these kinds of things, means in no way that you have to take any of this material and make it your new worldview. But what I'm hoping you do is you become open to this idea that the idea of security, the ideas that float around it, the referent objects that are created in relation to it are incredibly powerful social forces that we need to be reticent about. We need to think carefully about and subject to this kind of critique, right? So what we've been doing so far this course is really thinking about that in terms of symbolic politics, right? About security as practice undertaken through language, the process through which actors either use their power to appeal to audiences to make the world appear a different way and thus mobilize particular kinds of security politics, or this more nebulous understanding of discourse, right? That there are these discourses that sort of ebb and flow inside of any society, and they will come to determine how people think about the world in very specific kinds of ways. Now, at the heart of what we're going to do this week is not a rejection of that fundamental idea, but a rejection of the idea that symbolic politics gets us close enough, right? There's this reactionary attitude emerging in critical security studies that, as important as symbolic politics are, they're not the whole story. Language in and of itself is not sufficient, according to this other set of readings that we're going to do this week, to help us understand that process about how a society comes to think about threats and what it means to address them, right? So what we're going to deal with are a series of ideas that are broadly taken from two particular theorists or bodies of theory. One is called actor network theory, which is borrowed from science and technology studies, the process by which a society comes to have facts, right? And how that's caught up with language, but also caught up with different kinds of material, physical kinds of things. And then assemblage theory, right, which emerges from the work of Deleuze and Guattari, two sort of late sort of Marxist ideas. Theorists from French continental philosophy who think about this idea, right? So the heart of assemblage theory, both of these ideas, is the idea that things have an inherent materiality, that they have an influence, that influence is important. And they don't just obey what it is we want them to do. And actually, when we use technology, we end up shaping how it's used, but it also ends up shaping us in very particular kinds of ways. An example I like to use is the internet and things like Canvas, right? I don't think I'm sort of like off base here by saying that actually the kinds of social interactions that you expect from me, the kinds of presence you expect from me in an online course, are really quite different than what I would have expected from an online course when I was an undergraduate all those years ago. Things like YouTube video lectures, really tidy sort of PowerPoint presentations, the availability of a learning management system like Canvas that works. All of these things are things that, yes, facilitate this great sort of course that we have, but also change social expectations, right? And the idea here is not that that's necessarily bad, but we should think about that, right, when we talk about how we conduct ourselves. So what this means is that objects and things are not just passive conduits for what we want to do. Actually, what we think we want to do is going to be shaped by the nature of the things that we associate, right? And what is and is not possible because of their nature will end up implicitly and very subtly shaping how we think about the world. The idea here is maybe even to go all the way back to use the Habermas or the Heidegger sort of quip. If you have a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. It's this idea that the tools you use will deeply shape how you think about the world. For those who follow the work of people like Bruno Latour and others who defined actor network theory, I would really suggest, if this is all very brand new to you, you do some Googling about Bruno Latour and actor network theory. He goes so far as to claim that the objects that we talk about in social spaces are actants, that they have this subtle influence. They're not actors. Actors are people who think, rationalize, and act strategically. But material things do have this influence that sort of is beyond just their simply being there. And that's because of they have this very material agency, right? So one really famous example, right, that Bruno Latour uses in one of his books are speed bumps. Now, the first thing is you need to realize is Bruno Latour is French. He wrote predominantly in French and then had his work translated. And in French, a speed bump is actually called a sleeping policeman, right? And that's what makes this example so good, right? And Latour actually in the paper has this funny point about how we don't actually get police officers to sit in parking lots and sort of have a nap and then wait for their presence to be needed, right? But yet anybody knows that when you go to a parking lot, actually it's a very structured environment. How you're able to act is deeply structured, and your expectations of other people's behavior is shaped by that structure, all without it being directed or this sort of common shared narrative, right? So in parking lots, what we really need to do is we need to regulate a traffic pattern, right? We need to focus the driver. They need to be paying attention. No cell phone use in the parking lot. We also need to ensure everyone's following rules, obeying crosswalks, not going too fast, not going around turns that they're not supposed to be in, right, et cetera, et cetera. The problem here is management. How do you do that? How do you create and regulate these rules without the sort of seeming weirdness of direct enforcement, but actually having a police officer sit there and go around and cite you for all these things? What we actually do is we use the materiality of a set of objects. We use cars, speed bumps, curbs, their design, paint, signs, all kinds of things to actually create a physical environment that will force the actors more or less to follow a stated set of expectations and rules, right? The idea here, and this is without the sort of normal disciplinary methods of the state, right? So the very material reality of a parking lot, if it's been well designed, will actually do the work of creating a social pattern in that environment, right? And that materiality is what matters. And the reason why we can make people do this, well, if you run over a speed bump too fast, you're going to hurt your car. Your car's very expensive. You're not going to like it, right? This materiality is sort of deeply important, and that's what's really, really important to note here. So it helps to think of assemblage in a literal sense here. So the parking lot's an example of an assemblage because we've identified a pattern of behavior that we want to see, right? And then we've assembled these different kinds of things, different rules, expectations, but also speed bumps, signs, paint, curb designs, in order to bring this into existence, right? And that the patterns of behavior we want to explain are the result of putting things of various kinds together. The $10 academic versions, these are heterogeneously engineered. We take symbolic politics, ideas, language, discourse, and then we put them with material things in order to create this assemblage of things that will produce a particular pattern of politics. So in critical security studies, this has been leveraged in order to refer to, in what's often referred to as the new materialist turn, to discuss all manner of ways in which security politics emerge and function. Some examples of this, which you're going to be exposed to over the course of this week, are the ways in which drones, specifically the systems used to operate them, shape how we perceive the battlefield in ways that create these repetitive patterns in the use of force that result in things like civilian casualties. Right. The idea here is that there's actually something very important about looking at the battlefield through drones, right? That produces this understanding of what's happening. And then also how the material qualities of things like oil and its transport create particular patterns of international order, right? And how the process of organizational management may take particular forms because, or make particular kinds of security practices possible. So this is going to be the Bueger piece on standard operating procedures and charts and maps, right? They are actually what make the counterinsurgency politic or counter-piracy politics possible. So in each of these instances, the argument is generally the same. There are things with material influence that contribute to the creation of particular configurations of security politics, and that to understand them, we must trace these influences, right? This is a contingent understanding of security politics, like the symbolic ones that we've discussed so far this term. But they're unlike that in very particular kinds of ways. The main difference is that there's the addition of materiality, right? What remains, however, is a dedication to the idea that security politics are constructed and therefore have a history of development. This is the dedication to historicism is then related to trying to understand other alternative ways of doing security. The idea here is that actually when we think about drone war, when we think about counterterrorism, actually the way we think about dealing with terrorist groups has a lot more to do with the materiality of drones and the nature of terrorist groups, right? And that by associating the war on terror with the practice of using drones in these ways, we're actually obfuscating other ways in which we could engage with this problem, which may be more productive, right? But it's important to note that, like discourse or speech act theory, new materialism does not really tell you what security politics are, but how to think about them. It's a deeply empirical one. It's the idea that a society thinks about security politics in a particular way because it's assembled particular ideas, language, things, and practices together, and that in order to understand what they will and will not securitize or what they will and will not do, we need to trace that. So drone warfare, for instance, is a really interesting example. Here, the perspective of drone targeting system, this displacement of risk, and the relative cost of these weapon systems have all been argued to have made the use of force far more easier. It's easier to think about... train. If you've never had class at the Parkville campus, you know that I just sit here and wait and don't try to record another video because this happens every 10 or 15 minutes. So arguably this has meant that the use of force has become less politically fraught, which means that we're more easily willing to use military force in ways that we might not otherwise do, right? So critical theorists often argue that the resulting civilian casualties, as unintentional as they may be, nonetheless work against our stated goals and thus entrench threats. So this is the idea that it's the materiality and how it shapes our perception of the world and how other actors come to shape our come to have their perceptions of us shaped that matter here, right? I just wanted to point out also that in addition to the screencast, I'm really looking for you to try to be empirical and analytical here, not just a general observation, but to actually think through what it would mean to trace through these assumptions in the reality of our everyday moment, right? Really looking forward to hearing from you and your thoughts on this, and hope you have a great afternoon.